Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with Jan Krikke from the Netherlands, ASEAN correspondent for the Asia Times, and also the author of a few interesting books, When India Eclipses China, Chinese Roots of the Modernist Revolution, and also Leibniz and Einstein, and what is it, China. And you have an integral perspective on all of these three books coming out soon, as I understand it. Can I just ask you about that first, and then we're going to talk about money and what's going on today?
Sure. I've been writing about Asia on a variety of topics, current affairs, economics, science, art, even religion, robotics, artificial intelligence, and uh, I I condensed all my writing in a very short little bundle, and that summarizes my findings, if you will. And the title is uh, creating a planetary culture, and then the subtitle is uh, European science, Chinese aesthetics, and Indian transcendence. And it covers uh, basically art, science, and religion or spirituality, if you will.
Mhm.
And I make the point that we all know that Europe developed natural science, which moved humanity to a higher level, right? Uh, that's how we developed technology and our modern world, right? So that story is well known. What is not so well known is that there is an there was a movement starting in the 19th century. Uh, in the West, we know it as the Modernist Revolution, which changed European traditional aesthetics in art and architecture. Uh, European art was traditionally based on optics, optical realism, right? We developed linear perspective and clair obscure, the effect of light and shadow. So think of Rembrandt, Vermeer, all these beautifully optically realistic images. And European classical architecture was has its roots in sculptural traditions, right? If you look at Greek classical architecture, uh, the pillars and the architraves, that was all made by architects who were really sculptors, right? They made stone to fit an architectural purpose out
Mhm.
of a sculptural tradition. So that lasted until that classic architecture and the classic art lasted until the middle of the 19th century. That's when a few artists in France discovered the Japanese woodblock print, the ukiyo-e. And the ukiyo-e originated in China, and it was based on a non-optical pictorial language, right? They didn't use optics to depict the landscape or portraits and what have you. So the Impressionist movement, they moved away from optical representation, right?
Mhm.
The impetus was the Japanese print. At the same time, uh, architects, foremost among them, Frank Lloyd Wright, was inspired by Japanese architecture uh, to move away from that sculptural tradition in architecture. The reason was simple. The Industrial Revolution created new building materials, right? Concrete slabs,
Steel.
structured steel, right? Those those industrial forms, rectilinear forms, uh, uh, they could not be applied using sculptural aesthetics, right? They needed a structural principle. So Frank Lloyd Wright pioneered an aesthetic vocabulary for industrially produced materials. That was in the late 19th century. His work influenced the modernist revolution in Europe in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. So modernist architects in Europe, they borrowed from Frank Lloyd Wright's vocabulary to develop modernist architecture that we know today.
Mm-hmm.
So while the West developed a natural science, the East developed what I call a natural aesthetics. And the coming together of these two principles is at the heart of our modern world, right? One subject that intrigued me a lot was that while Europe developed linear perspective, China developed axonometry, which is sometimes called parallel perspective. And the modernists in Europe in the 1920s embraced that Chinese perspective to render their architectural conceptions. Mm-hmm. So today, if you use a computer-aided design program, it will have that Chinese projection system built in, right? So anything we build today, whether or not a skyscraper or a space shuttle or a suspension bridge, they all start on the drawing table as axonometric projections. So that's why the first chapter in my new book is called "Why the World Depends on a Chinese Perspective." Because every architect in the world, every designer in the world, every engineer in the world is using that projection system developed in China about 1,000 years ago. So the natural science of the West and the natural aesthetics of the East are creating our material environment, right? At some point, technology will be able to produce most people with all the material needs, right? We've already made enormous advances by lifting millions of people out of poverty, right? The Chinese have done so in the last 40 years, 50 years. India is about to do so. So even though the overall picture looks a bit gloomy with the conflict in Ukraine, if you take a little bit distance and you zoom out a little bit, you see that more and more people are lifted out of poverty, have access to education, housing, food, medical care. The number of people living in absolute poverty below $1 a day is decreasing every year, and supposedly nobody will be extremely poor in that definition of $1 a day in about another 10 years or so, right? So once we have our material needs taken care of, and robotics takes away most of the need for physical labor, and artificial intelligence takes away the need for most of our mental labor, right? What's next? What do we do next, right? The next step is that it is no longer important of what you know as a doctor, as an accountant, as an engineer, because AI will be able to do it better than you do. So you won't be able to identify with your job anymore. Like, that's how we identify. I'm a writer, I'm an accountant, right? That is who you are, right? Your job identifies determines your identity. So once that is gone, what is next? What will people do to fill the void that comes from not not being able to identify with your work anymore because the work has been done by artificial intelligence, right? So that is when you come to Indian transcendence, which has the richest reservoir of spiritual knowledge anywhere, right? The yogic tradition, the meditation, and so forth. So that's the gist of the book. That we go from a a world where we are concerned with our material well-being to a world where we will be concerned with our spiritual well-being, if you will, right?
And this book is on its way out soon. This year, is that right? Did you? You have it reviewed right now?
Uh, it's. I would think it should be available next month.
Oh, okay. So very soon. I'll put something up on the website. I think that the foundational aspect of our discussion today involves this integral approach that you're talking about. When you talk about culture, when you talk about knowledge, trade, and so forth, particularly with the center being in somewhere, in Eurasia, China and India traditionally. So I think that one way I'd like to go is to talk about money, as we had originally mentioned. But I did want to say that I think that uh, what I hear is a lot. In fact, in a lot of my writings, I counter some of this, some of the technological uh, issues that you mentioned, and also the more positive aspects that people talk about, a reduction of poverty, and so forth. And we don't need to go into the debate right now, but principally because of the foundational matter of material and how we're going to make it. If we could do nanotechnology safely, which we don't know, we don't have any idea, then maybe it could rematerialize like you're talking about. Or maybe if we took, gigatons and gigatons of material that we've already made and rematerialize, it could. But I don't see that happening either. So I think that this rematerialization is going to have to come from the earth itself. I think that gets into some problems with, these very positive outlooks, techno optimism or social optimism and so forth. So that's what I write about, and I'm looking forward to reading, what you're writing. Let me. Would you like to provide a counter, or can we go into money? Do you have a?
No, go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
Let's pick up where we left off.
I wanted to give you a chance for the last word on that one. For money, recently we had talked about with again within this integral perspective that you're talking about, which I think is fundamentally correct. The center of the culture and so forth as being in Asia, Eurasia, and so forth. Uh, and one of the major topics, of course, is money, and has been throughout what we call civilization, of course, and even a lot of the time, most of the time, money has been virtual. You have some bamboo ticks on the grocer or whatever, or it's done by the priests and the women of the temple in Samaria, and they have the silver and they move that around and so forth. But I think that the issue of money is important these days because of these tectonic changes that we see going on. There's war in Eurasia. There's China coming about. There's negotiated peace in the Middle East. So I mentioned some of these larger ones, but I wanted to ask you to go to zero in on money within this integral idea that you have and what's happening right now. Because, for example, I see the other day de-dollarization, the dollar's going away immediately, and so on. Can you talk about this?
Well, the dollar is not going to go away immediately. I think the dollar will be around for a while. The question is, what will be its value? That is the real issue, right? Some economists would argue that the dollar is overvalued as it is. The more fundamental problem is, I think we touched upon this earlier, is that Um, uh, Throughout history, uh, gold and other precious metals have been valued by virtually all cultures, right? From South America to China, uh, everybody valued gold for some reason. Uh, uh, I don't care about gold, right? If somebody said, "Here's a necklace, please wear it every day," a gold
I
necklace, I
wouldn't
would
wear it
say,
either.
"No, thank you," right? But there is something about gold that has retained its appeal for at least 5,000 years that people have been able to trace. So that makes it a rather special metal, right? That it is universally valued. That is also the reason why gold has often been the calibrator, if you will, of money. So
Mhm.
when a government uh, a banknote traditionally, right? A banknote was basically an IOU for gold, right? And the last example of this and how we got to our current situation was in Europe in the up starting, I think, in about 15th, 16th, 17th century. You had the goldsmith, right? He made jewelry and other stuff of gold, right? So then he started to offer extra services. Let's say you go to the gold shop, the goldsmith, and you buy 5 necklaces. And then you think, well, where am I going to keep this? Right? I don't want to keep it at home because
They
that's
have right here
maybe
in Southeast Asia, right here in Southeast Asia, this same thing, right on the
sure.
street, you know. Yeah.
Right. So the goldsmith offered custodial services. He said to his customers, I can keep the gold for you for safekeeping. Right. So a lot of people did that. So these goldsmiths, they at some point they had like maybe 100 kilos of gold or something, right? And what they did was they started to loan it out to other people. So let's say you bring a kilo of gold to the gold shop, right? And the gold shop gives you an IOU, right? I owe you
Like
1,000
a
or 1 kilo of
like
gold,
a
right?
document or something.
Certificate, right? So uh, you have a claim with the goldsmith of 1 kilo of gold, right? So you keep it there, and the goldsmith thinks, "Wow, I have all this gold here. Maybe I can make some money with this gold and loan it out as collateral to other people, right?" So he became not only a goldsmith, he also became a kind of a bank, right?
Fractional reserve banking at the
Right,
beginning.
right. So he would some customer would come in and say, "I need to buy a boatload of wood from Scandinavia, and I need a collateral of 1 kilo of gold. Can you give that to me?" So the goldsmith writes out an IOU to the wood trader, right?
Mhm.
The wood trader takes it to the wood seller and says, "Here's my collateral," right? So the wood trader can go to the gold shop and pick up the gold, right? But the wood trader can also use that voucher, that IOU, to give it to a shipyard to repair his boat,
Right.
right? So you know where I'm going, right? These vouchers, they can be traded in, they can be sold, bought and sold for goods and services, right?
Can I
So
just interject something just really quick so that people listening can could understand how easy this is? Let's say I take like one of these little stickies, you know, like some kind of sticky thing like this, and I write on there, I guarantee you, uh, you know, uh, a water buffalo from out here, then we know how much that value is to people, and you can take that and you don't have the money to buy something or to whatever, but you do have this voucher, this little sticky pad that has my name on it. You can say, well, Layne has this buffalo over there, and it's worth this value. Then you give the sticky pad thing to someone else. It's the exact same kind of thing, just more complicated,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So when we use the word paper wealth, that's exactly what it is. It is wealth, but only on paper.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you have a counterparty risk, right? If you have $100 bill, you think, oh, I have $100 bill, which is true, but there's a counterparty risk with the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, right?
Right. It has to
They
have a
can,
debt for you to have that $100 bill. Yeah.
right, right. So anyway, to get back to the gold story, that model that that a goldsmith with 1 kilo of gold would give out vouchers for 20 kilos of gold. That is how our modern banking system works,
Mm-hmm.
right? They create vouchers, and a piece of paper like a $100 bill or a U.S. Treasury bill.
Or a bond.
These are
Yeah.
basically just IOUs, right? That's all they are, right? And they all have counterparty risk. They depend on the good faith of the issuer, right? So, what is the value of why is gold valued so much? If you own gold, you have no counterparty risk.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody can claim it from you. Nobody can uh, loan out money against it, right?
They can steal it.
It's your. They
They
can
can
steal
steal
it.
it.
They can steal it, but it has no
it,
legal. It has
it
no
has its,
legal counterparty claim, right? It is yours. It is
it's a
yours alone.
commodity.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
because it is universally valued. That's why it is considered to be uh, a safe asset to have in time of economic financial turbulence, right?
And again, I just want to make a comment. We're speaking of particularly the time since Venice up to now, so modern era. You have what capitalism, then you have industrialism, and then of course going back, there's gold, but also silver before that, and a lot of this came about because of militarism, right? Instead of having to, ship 100 pigs along with your army, you just give the go the you put your face on this little coin thing and you give it to the soldiers, and then they can exchange it for the pigs in the villages along the way, and so forth and so on. So a lot of the thing about when we think of money today, which of course is fiat, which I'm sure you're getting to, when we think of gold, we're thinking of a lot about highly authoritarian militarized systems. So when people are promoting gold, they're not only promoting this cultural background, but they're also promoting ecological destruction because it's super destructive. And I'm going to get to a question in a moment of how we get out of this, but I wanted to hear the rest of what you had to say, and then ask you how do we get out of it. But anyway.
Well, the example of the gold shop, that is a metaphor for our modern banking system, in that sense that after World War II, the monetary system was overhauled, right? Because Japan and Germany and Italy and England, their currencies were in the tank, right? They had enormous debt and they printed too much money, which caused inflation. So there was a need for a reset. So uh, the when you do a monetary reset, you need a point of calibration, right? Your baseline, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So they the baseline for the reset in 1944 was that gold was valued at $32 an ounce. That became the benchmark.
How did they come up with this amount? Does it come from like having to mine it and how much the cost of mining is? No.
I would imagine at that time, at that moment, it was based on the number of dollars in circulation and gold holdings of the United States government.
Okay.
Right.
So they just did a division. So you go ounces and you have this number of dollars and then, okay, got it.
Right. So the reason that worked was, let's say France sells $1 million worth of wine to the United States, right? The United States pays for that with $100 bills or whatever, right? The French, in theory, the French could go to the Federal Reserve Bank and demand that $1 million in gold equivalent.
Right.
Because the dollar was as good as gold, right? So the US dollar was looked at as a voucher for gold, basically, right? Backed by gold. So $100 was a voucher for 3 ounces of gold, right? Mm-hmm. So that system worked well and got us out of the post-war economic trouble, right? Because it was a fixed rate, and if you have a fixed exchange rate, then it's easier to plan do long-term economic planning because you don't have to worry about inflation and price increases and so forth. So that system worked well until the mid-60s, when the United States engaged in two different kinds of wars: the war in Vietnam and the war on poverty, the Great Society program of President Johnson, right? So what they found out is that they didn't have the income, they didn't have enough tax revenue to finance both the Vietnam War and the war on poverty.
Okay.
So they started printing more money than they earned in tax revenue, right? So if you print more money than is backed by gold, that's a little bit similar to if you put a little bit copper in your gold coin, right?
Yeah, like they did. Well, the Romans did this, right?
Right. It devalues the currency, right? But because the United States, the US dollar became a global currency, it didn't really impact inflation because the United States exported inflation because they got cheaper products back from abroad, right? But late 60s, and the French became suspicious that the United States was printing far more dollars than they had gold. So the French government sent a warship to New York to repatriate the gold that they had stored there during World War II. Other countries followed, and by 1971, so many countries wanted to have gold for their dollars that President Nixon, was worried that it would deplete American gold reserves, right? So he temporarily closed the so-called gold window. That was a temporary measure meant to stabilize the markets. So what happened in effect was the end of the gold standard, right? Because you could not exchange the dollar for gold, meaning the gold was no longer backed by gold, but by the good faith of the United States government.
Okay, so August, was it August of 71? Is that when this happened?
August 71, yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So we're up to 50 years now of
Right,
this history that's going on.
right. But if you look at the chart from 71 till 2022, you see that the U.S. debt, the national debt, goes in a very steep, uh, uh, goes up in a very steep
Incline.
uh,
Yeah.
rate, right? Um, uh, what happened was that uh, since the U.S. government was no longer obligated to uh, give people gold for their dollars, they decided they could just print as many dollars as they wanted, and uh, they developed this modern monetary policy theory to justify that idea. A sovereign government can never go bankrupt because it can print all the dollars, all the money that it needs, until inflation hits, right? So inflation remained relatively muted all these years, right? The reason was that uh, the US dollar was a global currency, and the Chinese took dollars to send their exports to the United States. And the price of Chinese products was so much lower than the equivalent produced in the United States that the lower prices of Chinese goods, which you buy at Walmart's and on Amazon, that suppressed inflation, right? So
And
it
also
seemed,
U.S. militarism, because if it causes some problems, then people start to grab dollars that take dollars out of circulation, so it prevents inflation. It's another
uh,
aspect of the system.
well, see, the reason that the United States can maintain its military footprint around the world is for that very same reason, that it can print all the dollars it needs, and countries have to take dollars because until recently, they needed dollars to buy oil, to buy grain, to buy other commodities, because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. Everybody needed dollars, right?
Mhm.
So that system worked well until COVID, roughly. And then the stimulus, the monetary easing, the quantitative easing, that finally broke the camel's back. That was too much money being slushed around, that inflation was inevitable. And that's where we are now. We have official figures is like 8%, 5, 6, 7, 8%. Unofficial
At the
figures
time,
are double digit.
yeah, at the time I said it looked like it was going to be like 10 to 13 trillion, but it looks like it was what, 7 or 8 trillion? Is that right?
Well,
Or we don't know.
there were two stages, right? One was
Right, yeah.
the 208 financial crisis,
Right, but
and
I
then
mean the COVID, yeah, added all together.
yeah, the Biden administration added, I think, 7 trillion to the debt in 2 years'
So
time
so it was
because of
7
COVID.
trillion. Got it.
Yeah,
So I wasn't too far off then if you add up, trillions and trillions leading up to COVID, and then all of a sudden, wham, market.
right,
Basically, the market was destroyed at
right,
March of 2020, right?
right.
Okay, so all right, continue on with where are we today? Why is everyone talking about de-dollarization? I mean, Twitter is alight with it. What's happening?
Well, uh, de-dollarization would have happened anyway for pure economic reasons, right? Uh, it doesn't. China, if you depending on the stats that you look at, but by some measure, China is already the world's leading economy, right, in terms of international trade, right? So China is probably wondering, if we are selling products to, say, Indonesia, right? Let's say a Chinese computer company sells 10,000 laptops to Indonesia, right? That is invoiced in dollars, right? It's not invoiced in yuan. It's not invoiced in rupees. It's invoiced in dollars because that's the norm. It's just almost a little bit like if a Chinese trader goes to Indonesia and does a deal, they will speak nor Chinese nor Indonesian. They will speak English most likely, right? Mm-hmm. The English language is like it's the currency of the language world, right? But if a Chinese company sells products to Indonesia, invoices it in dollars, the dollars go to New York and they are processed in New York, and there the accounts are settled, right? So that worked well for the last since the Second World War, right? But the reason the Chinese are now beginning to have second thoughts about that arrangement is twofold. One is, why should we, as a leading industrial nation, have to use the currency of another country to trade with our neighbors, right? That's one aspect of it. But more consequential is what happens to the dollar when there is an unlimited amount of money printing, whether you call it quantitative easing or asset purchases. They have all these nice euphemisms, but it all means the same thing: printing more money, right? Which is devaluing the currency. So, to give you one idea about the extent to which the dollar has devalued, when Nixon closed the gold window, 1 ounce was $35, right? Today, 1 ounce is about $2,000.
Right, it's up there.
So, but now you have to think about a country like, say, Saudi Arabia, right? They have a limited resource, right? They have to get the most out of that limited resource because they don't have anything else, right? Basically. So they accumulate all these dollars from the oil sales, right? Let's say they have $1 trillion as a piggy bank, right? If that piggy bank deflates in value by 8%, 10%, maybe more, rather than generating income through interest payments, right? If let's say they put $1 billion in U.S. Treasuries, right, the Saudis, they get about 3 or 4%.
Second part related to multipolarity in the world. And in the last segment, we finished up with talking about the Saudis, for example, putting in, say, $1 billion in bonds, and they get a certain percent interest back. And we were also talking about gold. So if you'd like to pick up from there and then carry us on with the story. And
yeah, okay, yeah. There's a bit of a confusion about the issue of de-dollarization, right? Most people think, or the media reports this as mostly an issue about the United States abusing its position as a controller of the global reserve currency, right? Almost every company in the world, when it trades internationally, invoices in dollars, right? So the Chinese company selling goods to Indonesia will invoice its Indonesian client in dollars. That payment goes through New York. So in other words, the United States can monitor every transaction in the world that's done in dollars. So since it can monitor all transactions, it can also stop all transactions if it wants to, because the money has to go through New York, the clearinghouse in New York. So that is one reason why there is a trend towards de-dollarization, to reduce the risk of being exposed to American sanctions, either economically or financially. But there's another factor, and that is the decreasing value of the dollar due to excessive monetary easing, quantitative easing, money printing. It has many different names, but it all amounts to the same thing.
The young people say the printer goes burr like this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's this famous sort of animation of
Like a
the
meme.
Federal Reserve, the copy machine that churning out dollar bills, right?
Hmm.
So that if the conventional wisdom is that printing money causes inflation, because whenever you have too much of anything, it reduces the price, right? Tesla made too many cars. Now it offers a discount to get rid of them, right? It's not quite the same with money, but when you put too much money in circulation, it stands to reason that its value diminishes. Normally, you put as much money into circulation as is needed to keep up with economic growth, right? But if you print 10% more in dollars than the economy, the growth of the economy would justify, then you get too many dollars, and that will result in the lowering of the value of the money. So when companies and countries export to the United States, they get dollars in return, right? A typical example is oil producing countries. The United States now is largely self-sufficient, but it still imports energy from South America, Mexico, North America, I think, North Africa. So these countries, they accumulate dollar reserves, and they park that in the United States, often in treasury bills, because they are considered as good as money, as good as gold, and you get a percentage in return, right? Let's say 3-4%, depending on the Fed rate. The result of printing so much money has now resulted in inflation rates that are above the yields that you can get on either treasuries or savings accounts in banks and many other investments, bonds, even certain stocks. So let's say Saudi Arabia is a good example. They export oil around the world. They get dollars in return. They have to do something with those dollars, so they buy US treasuries. The treasuries yield 4%, 3, 4, 5%, depending on the rate. But the inflation rate is above that. The figures are disputed. Some people say it's 7%, 8%. If you use the benchmark that was used in the 70s and the 80s, then inflation currently would run at double digits, like 15. Some people say it's even higher, like 18. So if you have $1 million in US treasuries and you get 4%, yeah, and you lose, let's say, 5% on that every year, that's not a very good proposition, especially if you are making money with a finite resource like oil, right? At some point, the oil in Saudi Arabia will run dry, right? So at that time, they have to have enough other sources of income to compensate for the loss in oil revenue. So they put some money in US treasuries, but they also invest in green technology and infrastructure and so forth. So if you lose 5% of your sovereign wealth fund, which is what it is called, right? The national piggy bank is called a sovereign wealth fund. Norway has one. Most countries have one. The biggest ones are Norway, the Saudis, and some other oil-producing countries, probably. So if you lose 5% of your sovereign wealth every year, then you start looking for alternatives. And the alternative is not easily found because no other currency exists that has the range, the reach of the dollar, right? So the de-dollarization was going to happen ultimately with the relative growth of the Chinese and Indian economies vis-a-vis the American economy. It stands to reason that China and India at some point would want to get rid of the dollars and trade in their own currencies because they have a larger economy and a larger international trade. To replace the dollar as a reserve currency is complicated because the dollar is like a benchmark, right? Everybody thinks in terms of dollars. Bitcoin is, all cryptocurrencies are valued in dollars, right? Oil is valued in dollars.
Well, it's like it's a mental psychological thing, and also the accounting ledgers
exactly,
right.
right. But now the problem has now become a little different. The difficulties of introducing an alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency. The difficulty is now overcome, if you will, by the urgency of the problem. One being that the United States continues to run massive deficits and continues to print money. So with the difference between the yield on the treasuries and the inflation rate, something has to give, right? So nobody really wants to take responsibility of killing the dollar, right? Not even the Chinese want to kill the dollar because they still rake in $1 billion a day net on exports to the United States, right? So what will probably happen, that's my sense, is that the first step to de-dollarization will be the creation of a settlement currency. That's a kind of an accounting unit that people can use to trade between countries, right? So China sends 10,000 laptops to Indonesia, and Indonesia pays with this new settlement currency, which will be tied either wholly or in part to gold, right? So let's call it a BRICS currency, because that's where the initiative comes from. BRICS is the combination of these 6 countries that are trying to form an alternative economic trade bloc that will
it's more like BRICS is all other countries now. It's so many want to join. We were talking about Mexico, for example. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But BRICS, it's the best way to look at BRICS is it's a counterweight to the G7, right? So the G7 is not just those 7 countries, but it's lots of European, Anglo-Saxon countries, right? BRICS is not just Brazil, South Africa, India, China, but it is also a lot of countries that are economically already closely linked to those countries. Turkey is one of them, but there's about 24 that have indicated that they want to join BRICS. So let's say BRICS will create an accounting unit that is backed by gold, right? So countries doing trade between themselves, between Russia and China, between China and India, they can use the BRICS accounting unit to bypass the dollar system, right?
Mhm.
So they create a benchmark. Each currency will be benchmarked against gold, right? So whether it's the Chinese yuan